we have been hearing about the role of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping changing the direction of policy, doubling down on security after the 20th Party Congress, and of course having significant involvement and responsibility for the policies in Xinjiang and in other ethnic regions. I am now interviewing Cai Xia. Cai Xia is a Chinese dissident and scholar of political theory. She was a member of the People's Liberation Army from 1969 to 78, and a member of the Chinese Communist Party until 2020. And they don't like her in the Communist Party anymore, I understand. Additionally, she was a professor at the Central Party School of the CCP from 1998 to 2012, where she taught high-ranking members and officials of the CCP, including leading provincial and municipal administrators and cabinet-level ministers. This is really quite something, isn't it? During her time in academia, Cai Xia often appeared in the Chinese news media, state media. In the 2000s, she started becoming disillusioned with the CCP and began writing criticism of certain CCP actions. In 2020, her criticisms of the CCP and Xi Jinping led to her expulsion from the CCP. She's written for Radio Free Asia and Foreign Affairs. She's been interviewed by The Economist, CNN, and the New York Times. She's living in the United States since 2019. Same as myself. I've been living in the United States since 2019. So we're both immigrants, right? There we go. Although I can go back to Germany if I want to, thankfully. Thank you so much, Mrs. Cai, for making the time, for sharing your insight and your distinguished knowledge with us. And I would like to ask a couple of questions, and we have competent translation of these questions. So feel free to answer at length and to give us your insight on these questions. I have prepared about 3 to 4 questions, and we have about 20 minutes. My first question is, in your opinion, how is Xi Jinping different from previous Chinese leaders? What drives him? What makes him tick?
首先让我借这个机会啊，向共产主义受难者基金会大会主办的和各个方面的人表示一个感谢。给我这么一个机会，能够跟大家一起见面，跟大家一起来讨论中国问题。
First, I would like to use this opportunity to thank the Foundation for Victims of Communism and thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak with everyone and to participate in this exchange.
谈到习近平的个人风格，我的感觉是这样的，就是他显然是一位强硬派的领导人，他的领导风格是比较强硬的。那么我们都知道，最近中国国内的所谓的第三代领导核心江泽民去世，江泽民后面的胡锦涛，他们两个是在习近平前面的这个前任。那么我们可以看到，胡锦涛、江泽民和习近平的风格截然不同。胡锦涛和江泽民，他们是有现代文明意识的，他们是希望中国面向世界、面向未来的。但是如何把中国往前推进？中国的问题很复杂，党内的阻力也很大，所以呢，他们在做这些就是中国深化改革的问题时候，他们是瞻前顾后。就是非常犹豫地往前走，所以我们看到呢，它是相对是一种温和的，对各方面的问题处理比较温和。而到习近平这一块呢
You interrupt her when you need to translate, right?
She can stop whenever she...
Okay, good, all right.
So as for Xi Jinping's personal style, I'll share some of my thoughts with you. He certainly can be described as a hardliner. That would be the first adjective I would use to describe him. And as we all know, lately the so-called third generation of Chinese leaders, Representative Jiang Zemin, passed away. And so Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao were the two leaders who preceded Xi Jinping. And we can see that in terms of their personal style and approach, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, and Xi Jinping were all extremely different from each other. Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, I think, can be categorized in one group, and they had a sort of awareness of modern civilization. They wanted to move forward. They wanted to turn China towards the future, towards the world, and they considered the question of how we can help China move forward. And of course, there was inertia and resistance within the party. So when they were conducting their deep reforms, they were moving forward very slowly. And I think that they can overall be described as moderates.
那么，习近平的个人风格是比较强硬的。他这个强硬呢，基于几个点。第一点就是说，中国经过30年的改革开放，它本身积累的经济社会矛盾背后的深层次的中国政治改革问题没有解决，所以呢，在到了习近平掌握国家权力的时候，党内的腐败，党和中国民众之间的矛盾，民族地区之间的矛盾就显得非常的尖锐。那么这就有一个怎么解决这个问题的思路。这是一点，我讲它的强硬是因为客观上讲，经济和社会发展很快，带来的各种矛盾一任一任的推下来，没有能够解决，到他这儿就变成了一堆非常复杂而又非常尖锐的一些问题摆在他面前。
So as I said, Xi Jinping is certainly a hardliner. And one of the reasons is that over the course of the 30 years of the reform and opening up policy, there has been a series of economic and social problems that have accumulated and that have not been addressed at the political level. So when Xi Jinping consolidated power, China was still facing numerous issues, including corruption and relations between different ethnic groups, and the situation was very complicated. So how can this be addressed? Objectively, Xi Jinping inherited a very complicated situation because the economy and society had developed very quickly, but the problems that were accumulating were just being pushed back and postponed. And essentially, they piled up into this complex knot of issues that he was facing.
那么，习近平呢，他的第二点，我说他是强硬风格，就是强硬派风格，前任是温和。为什么？是因为解决这些个经济社会的复杂矛盾，它有2种不同的思路。这个就是在胡锦涛和江泽民面前，他们是有现代文明的意识的，而习近平不存在现代文明的这种视野，他对现代政治、现代经济社会的发展，在相当程度上是陌生的，因此他的主要思路是什么呢？加强统治，巩固权力。因此，他的解决问题的方式，第一位是放在巩固权力、巩固统治。他的知识资源和思想资源是有限的，所以他在加强权力、巩固统治的时候，不自觉的是倒回去走。而如果说放在胡锦涛和江泽民这一类的温和的领导人面前，他有可能仍然是摇摆，就是逐步的改革，而不是单一的强化控制、强化镇压。
So I said Xi Jinping is a hardliner, and he was preceded by moderate leaders. Now, I told you about the accumulating social and economic tensions, and there are 2 approaches to addressing these. Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, they took a more moderate approach, and they understood the values of modern civilization. And this cannot be said for Xi Jinping. He has completely different approach to the political, social, economic environment, and his approach is essentially only founded on being a strong man, on consolidating power, and grasping as much power as possible. So that is the crux of his approach. And I think that intellectually and in terms of his knowledge that he has accumulated, his resources are much more limited. And so that is why he is taking China backwards. When Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin were conducting reforms and conducting policy, they were also kind of swaying from side to side. They were moving ahead slowly, but they were certainly not only focused on control and oppression.
所以他的这个强硬的做法，就是我们明显的看到，就是意识形态的倒退、政治上的倒退 和社会管理的这种控制加强了。那么还有一些就是强硬的镇压，所以我讲它是强硬风格，而不是一个温和风格。
And the reason I say Xi Jinping is a hardliner and not a moderate is because we're obviously moving backwards in terms of ideology, we're moving backwards in terms of politics, and he's exerting greater and greater social control. So he is really focused on oppression and is not a moderate.
And my question would be very briefly, as a brief follow-on question. Why do you think Xi Jinping is that way? Why is that his approach?
为什么这么强硬？为什么这是他的方法？
这个习近平为什么会这么强硬？我的感觉是这样的。首先就是共产党他所有的在中国国内所做的一切经济和社会发展的努力，它的根本目的是为了加强共产党在中国国内的这种领导权，就是控制权和统治地位。因为社会主义这4个字对于中国共产党来讲，它有2个最根本的东西是不能扔掉的。第一就是共产党必须控制一切，它必须是一个一直是掌握政权的这个政党。那么所以呢，习近平的所有的一些个做法，他都是要考虑怎么去加强这个共产党的权力，而共产党的权力呢，往往就是在他的眼里看呢，首先是巩固他个人的权利和地位，所以这个是一个方面非常重要的一点，就是为了巩固个人的权利和巩固共产党的权利，他必须要强硬。
Well, why is he this way? Well, first of all, the first point I would like to make is that all of the economic and social development programs initiated by the Chinese Communist Party in China were done with one goal, which is to build a stronger CCP, to increase its governing power, and to consolidate power, because the word socialism, as far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned, essentially means that the Communist Party must be in control of all aspects of political life, must consolidate all political power. And so the reason that Xi Jinping is so focused on strengthening the Communist Party is because he thinks that the Communist Party is stronger if he is stronger personally, if he personally controls more power. So I think he is trying to consolidate individual and Communist Party power in order to achieve these goals.
中国共产党的每一代领导人，他上来当党的和党和国家的就是最高领导人，他都要有一个权威。那么邓小平的权威是源于他最早就是跟毛泽东那一代的人一起，就是有他的政治资历。然后到了那个江泽民呢，江泽民他有他在那个40年代末时参加中国共产党的那些资历，包括他的这种50年代留苏和他的这个文化教育、他的工作经历的这些资历，这是他的一个权威。而胡锦涛呢，我们就可以看到这个领导人的权威是越来越弱，所以我们讲胡锦涛是个弱主。那么到了习近平这儿呢，他就更没有那样的个人资历或者叫个人的出色的政绩，使他走到了这个领导人的位置上。他只是因为是一个中国共产党内部确定的我们的孩子，就是他的父亲是开国的，就是我们讲的老的领导人的孩子。那么当初邓小平和陈云是在这个范围内寻找就是未来国家党和国家领导人，他唯一的他就能够沾的就是这个是他的资历，而他的个人政绩并没有那么多，所以他上来的时候他是比较弱的，他也没有他的班底，没有他的团队，所以他要抓住反腐败，来以反腐败的这个名义来安插他自己的人，形成他的团队，掌握各种权力。而中国共产党在改革开放以后的几十年当中，市场经济放开了，政治权力没有控制，党内的腐败是普遍的。所以抓哪一个人，就是在党内抓反腐败，人人都害怕。所以这样呢，习近平的强硬做法，他就能使他在整个这个共产党内把他的权威立起来，同时他对整个社会的反对派的力量和公民社会是全部打压下去，这样他就能够把社会控制起来。那么我们讲民族地区同样也是实行这样的强硬政策，他看到的就是如不强硬，也许就是 就是不能控制局面，只有强硬才能控制。所以我们讲它是这样的一个思路。
And every leader of the CCP is both a leader of the party and of the country. So in order to govern such a massive structure, they need to have the necessary legitimacy. And Deng Xiaoping, he had a kind of political acumen. And then after him, Jiang Zemin, he had legitimacy because he was involved in the Chinese Communist Party in the 1940s. And in the 1950s, because of what he was doing, because of his culture, his general culture, and his education, he had legitimacy. And then Hu Jintao actually had less legitimacy than the leaders who came before him, which is one of the reasons he was known as a relatively weak leader. And Xi Jinping really didn't have very many personal achievements to bolster his legitimacy as China's leader. And it is only because of his connection to his father, because of his political connection, that he was able to assume this role. And in this environment, he really didn't have very many personal achievements. And so when he became president, he was a relatively weak leader. He didn't have his own team of people helping him. And this is when he launched the anti-corruption campaign. This allowed him to establish a team. It allowed him to consolidate power. And while China was conducting its reforms and opening up policy, the political realm was not reformed. So corruption was rampant in the party. And whenever you mention anti-corruption campaigns to people in China, they are terrified because this is something that was used by Xi Jinping to bolster his own legitimacy and also to oppress civil society. This also relates to his approach to these areas with ethnic minorities, because he has also used a very hardline approach. And his idea is that if you don't use a hardline approach, you will lose control over these areas.
Is there one particular document or piece of writing that you would recommend that we read to understand Xi Jinping better?
来了解一下习近平。
这个现在是这样的，就是中文世界啊，关于对习近平的评价，它是有很多文章，但是由于中国不是一个正常的言论环境，所以有些对习近平的评价的文章，它是以匿名方式来写的。那么因此匿名方式写呢，它既有事实又有自己的判断，但是有些东西是你没有办法去查证它的正伪的。所以在这个中文世界有流传，但是在英文世界，我自己的英文不是很好的，所以我不太了解英文世界能够看哪些书。中文世界呢，今年的上半年啊，有几篇在那个中文的世界里边的，比方客观评价习近平，还有习近平与乌克兰吧，好像是那个，就是讲习近平和普京的那个。这个两篇实际上从他的背景，他的这个上来就是工作10年当中的一些个情况，是有一些个东西的，但是我不知道能不能翻成英文。
In Chinese, there are many articles and materials that are available, but because China doesn't have an environment that is conducive to freedom of speech, they are all written anonymously. So as a result, they contain facts, they contain some analysis. It's hard to fact check what's in them. And because my English isn't very good, I don't really know what's available in English. But in the first 6 months of this year, there were 2 articles that were published that I would recommend in Chinese. The first one is called An Objective Assessment of Xi Jinping. And the second one is called something like Xi Jinping in Ukraine. And these both are quite good. They look at Xi Jinping's activities over the past 10 years. And I don't know if they can be translated into English, but they're available in Chinese.
因为这个中文的，就是在大陆中国官方的写习近平的，是有很多书籍，但是那些呢，明显是带着一个个人的那种怎么讲呢，就是比较夸张吧，或者讲个人崇拜的这个色彩写的习近平的这些东西。所以我觉得那个好像没有太大的帮助，但是你要了解某些个他过去的情况，或许大陆官方的书你可以看，但是要有一个判断力。
In mainland China, of course, there are many works written about Xi Jinping, but they focus more on the personality cult, and a lot of the information is highly exaggerated, so I don't know if I would recommend it. But if you want to learn about his past experience, you could look at some of the official writings, just maintain a critical spirit while you do so.
We have about 3 minutes left, and so there's a final question, maybe a slightly shorter response. Were you surprised by the recent mass protests against Beijing's COVID measures that were sparked by the fire in Urumqi? And what does it mean for the government and for Xi Jinping?
对于政府来说意味着什么？
乌鲁木齐这个火灾啊，其实在全国是引起了震动的。这也是包括我在内的海外的华人都是很震动的，因为那个火灾的那个惨剧我们在视频上是看到的，所以它很快就引起乌鲁木齐的市民站出来反抗，要求解封，否则的话这个人命关天啊，像这样的人道劫难在中国已经不是乌鲁木齐一起，而是有至少是从去年年底到现在开始吧，这种清零的严格的风控，造成了中国国内的大量的这种人道灾难的这种惨剧。那么乌鲁木齐这一起呢是非常重大的一次这个事故，或者讲是一次灾难，所以乌鲁木齐的社区居民站起来反抗和要求解封、要求自由，在这一点上来讲，对我来讲是不出意外，但是呢，同时也是非常敬佩乌鲁木齐的市民们，因为大家知道，在中国的新疆，中国共产党他对于新疆的控制和这种镇压是非常严厉的。那么在这么严厉的地区能够站起来反抗，这样的要冒着很大的风险和很大的生命危险的，所以我们讲说新疆人民这次给我们大家的震动是很大，因此它就引起全国的各方面的那个支援。所以我们看到这次是在2天之内，全国有10多个城市蔓延到10多个省，在举行各种各样的抗议。
The fire in Urumqi sparked a protest movement across China, and I saw that my Chinese friends living abroad were also following this very closely because we all saw the videos of the fire in Urumqi and of what happened. And we saw the people of Urumqi protesting against the lockdown, demanding that the lockdown be lifted. And this kind of humanitarian disaster, I must say, is not confined to just Urumqi. We have seen humanitarian disasters unfold all across China, starting with the zero COVID policy, starting last year with the amount of control that the government has exerted and the lockdowns across China. So I think Urumqi is an extremely important event. This is an important tragedy. And we saw the locals demanding freedom, which I think is extremely admirable that the people of Urumqi are willing to rise up and protest, because we know how much control the CCP exerts in Xinjiang and how it oppresses the people of Xinjiang. So even in the fact that in this kind of tightly controlled area, people can protest, are willing to protest, to risk their lives, is really a source of inspiration. So I would say I'm not surprised by the protest movement that this sparked. And then, of course, it turned into more of a national trend. And over the course of 2 days, there were protests in over 10 cities and over 10 provinces in China.
好，请允许我再讲几句啊。当这个事情发生以后，大家可以看到，这意味着中国民众他的忍耐已经到了极限，因为很多人已经到了一个无法生存的地步了。这是因为生存危机逼得人们起来反抗的，这是第一。第二呢，我们可以看到习近平很罕见地做了让步，他现在就是整个中国的这个清零啊，他在开始结束了，就清零政策结束，他逐渐的解封了。那么这里边呢有几个，一个就是说，事实上这个1-2年的核酸检测和清零政策，它使整个社会经济停摆，就是瘫痪了，而这个地方财政因为核酸检测和这些，它花费了大量的财政，而地方财政现在没有一个省里的财政是有盈余的，它全部都亏空。地方的市县一级大概90%以上的县已经无法运转自己的财政了，它不得不停止这种就是清零，它停止解封，这是因为财政危机被逼出来的。第二个方面呢，他并不希望在他20大以后很快的就引起社会矛盾，政府和社会的这种矛盾的尖锐和紧张，因为后面到2023年的3月份，他还有一个关要过，就是国家主席他能不能连任。现在把矛盾搞激化了，对他后面连任国家主席其实是没有利的，所以我个人觉得这是他罕见的做了让步。这是第二点，我再说一点啊。第三点是， 因为他罕见的做了让步，因为现在的这种状况使中国的民众看到了习近平的权威不是不可以去冲击他、动摇他的。那么就是说，当人民不惧怕的时候，统治者的那种统治的权威基础就开始崩塌，那么这就会极大的鼓舞以后的民众起来进行反抗。这是一个方面。那么第二个方面呢，也因为是这样，我们就可以看到未来中国社会的政局，它会处在一个不知道什么时候又出现什么样的风险的这个过程当中。而这个3、4个月，在中国政府、中国党来讲，它是一个权力的完全不对称期间。就中央常委，他没有真正的能够进入政府部门工作。政府现在的总理和副总理全部都不是中央常委。那么这样的话呢，就是说，党和政。这个就是政府和政党的这2个系统，它是完全不匹配，就是不对称的，这就导致它的反应会出现各种各样的紊乱。那么，因此我们可以观察，在今后的3、4个月当中，中国还可能会出现一系列的紊乱的现象。所以我们讲未来的政局是比较难判断的。但是不是说习近平肯定就下去，或者说就是共产党肯定就会下台？我个人不这么认为。但他要经过一个非常动荡的这么一个时期，而经济和社会的危机会加深，而不是马上得到缓解。
So I just wanted to add a few comments. The first thing is that after these recent events, we can see that the people of China have really lost their patience with the government's policy, and people are basically unable to continue their livelihoods in this crisis. And it is this crisis that served as a catalyst for them to rise up and protest. The second point I wanted to make is that we can see that Xi Jinping actually made concessions. This is something that is very rare for him. We can see that the zero COVID policy and the lockdowns in China are slowly being lifted. And now there are fewer PCR tests being required, and all of these PCR tests and zero COVID policies have completely paralyzed the economy up till now. And this has had a really negative impact on the finances of the local governments. There are almost no provinces with a budget surplus. They're all in the red right now. And over 90% of the counties in China are not in a sustainable financial situation. So one of the reasons that this policy is being changed is because of finance. And additionally, I think Xi Jinping doesn't really want to have too many tensions after the 20th Party Congress, because there's another stage that he needs to move through in March of 2023. That is when it will be decided whether he can continue to serve as party secretary, and he doesn't want to have too much tension leading up to this. And third, because he made concessions and he made compromises, the people of China have seen that his legitimacy can be questioned, it can be challenged, and if people are not afraid, they can actually start to shake the foundations of his legitimacy. So I think that this will serve as an inspiration for people in the future and as a signal that they can protest and demand concessions. And then finally, I think that looking to the future, this kind of situation can rise up again in China without warning. We don't really know when it might happen again. Right now, for the past 3 or 4 months, there has been a kind of disconnect between the premier, the vice premier, and the Politburo Standing Committee. And this has led to some confusion in the response. So I think that we might see more turbulence in the 3 or 4 months to come. The future is very hard to predict. I don't think that Xi Jinping will step down or that the Chinese Communist Party will collapse, but I think that it will experience a turbulent period with more and more economic and social crises that will not be resolved.
Well, thank you very much indeed for this very enlightening commentary. 谢谢你。
谢谢大家。
And we will have a 5-minute coffee break.
As everyone takes their seats, I'll go ahead and introduce this final panel discussion. The panel on China's global ambitions, Beijing's foreign policy and power projection. I'm excited about this topic and the panelists we have to discuss this afternoon. Of course, under Xi Jinping, we've seen China's foreign policy take a coercive turn, and its attempts to influence global norms and institutions in line with its global ambitions have become much more overt. I personally saw this when I represented the U.S. at the UN in Geneva, and I look forward to discussing the multilateral aspect, China's current economic coercion, its military presence, and all of these things with our panelists as we begin. So let me do our brief introductions. Our panelists this afternoon, we have Michael Auslin. Michael is the Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow in Contemporary Asia at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. A historian by training, he specializes in U.S. policy in Asia and geopolitical issues in the Indo-Pacific region. We're also joined by Emily de la Bruyere. She is the co-founder of Horizon Advisory, a geopolitical consultancy, and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Her work focuses on China's digital ambitions, industrial policy, and platform geopolitics, as well as their implications for global security and the economic order. Next, we will hear from Russell Xiao, who's the executive director of Global Taiwan Institute, senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, and adjunct fellow at Pacific Forum. He is a former Penn Kemble Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and visiting scholar at the University of Tokyo's Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia. And lastly, we'll hear from Craig Singleton, who is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he analyzes great power competition with China. He previously spent more than a decade serving in a series of sensitive national security roles within the U.S. government, where he was primarily focused on East Asia. So with that as our brief introduction, I'd like to turn over to Michael for his thoughts and comments.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much, and thank you to the Foundation, not simply for inviting me, but for holding the forum, which is, I think, just a critical venue for talking about these issues. You've heard some incredibly interesting and knowledgeable panels today, and except for this part of the panel, the rest of this panel is as knowledgeable. So I think maybe what I can do is give a little bit of a historical perspective that may help us understand the implications of what China is doing in the international system and to the international system, and maybe bring some clarity as to what the responses should be. And then at the end, maybe just try to slaughter a few sacred cows that we have here in Washington. I think that, maybe not for this audience, we're all here for a reason because we probably share a similar mindset. But I think it's important to recognize that the historical record of U.S.-China relations is just starting to be written in many ways. And there is a struggle over that historical record. That's not just an academic exercise because it immediately and directly influences policy, right? Your interpretation of what the U.S. was doing, what China was doing, gives indications as to what policy should be. So it is a political exercise as much as it is an historical and intellectual exercise. I think it's becoming clearer now after 50 years, especially we can talk about whether it was a mistake to engage with China or not, but I think it's becoming clearer to try to be a little bit more specific and granular in understanding the strategies that both China and the United States pursued. And just for a minute or two, I'd like to lay those out, at least as I see them. I think the strategy that the United States ultimately pursued was not a simplistic one of engagement with China, but particularly post-1992. It was a presumption that the world system had reached a point of political equilibrium with the end of the Cold War. Sometimes we called this the Washington Consensus. Sometimes we called this the end of history and the triumph of liberal international capitalism. But in any case, we thought that the struggles over definitions of political regimes, successful political regimes, the way that the world was to be run, in essence, had concluded with the fall of the Soviet Union. We then thought that the best way to ensure that this system would continue was not simply building on the structure of international institutions that we had developed post-1945, but most importantly, was to bring China, the crown jewel of that post-Cold War world, into that Washington Consensus. And we convinced ourselves that the path of engagement from 1972 or 1979 onward had been leading inexorably to bringing China into that responsible stakeholder position, whether it was into the UN or into the World Trade Organization, or because we created a strategic and economic dialogue, a G2, or the like. So we were playing a political equilibrium game with, quite frankly, ourselves as the unipolar, benign hegemon. And this is something that we saw playing out in Europe in the 19th century post-Napoleonic Wars, although there you had two benign hegemons. You had the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Russia. But we basically took the same template. Conversely, China adopted a classical balance of power strategy. Now, we usually think of balance of power as saying, well, that creates what I was just talking about, an equilibrium. But it really doesn't. Classically, what a balance of power system is a system of unending struggle, competition, and warfare. That's what Europe went through in the 17th and 18th centuries until 1815 and Waterloo. China adopted largely this system of continually balancing against the United States, chipping away at United States influence, at United States power, using the benefits of the system in order to strengthen itself, certainly with reform and opening up with Deng Xiaoping, but never, of course, moving towards the type of political alignment with that liberal international system that we thought of. China never saw the system as legitimate, and this has the implications to what we're trying to talk about in this panel, which is explicitly asks, what are implications for the international system? The rhetoric that is used currently today, for example, by Xi Jinping, is dual-sided or dual-faced, right? On the one hand, there is the much more open and honest argument against this current system, talking about creating a more just international system, a more balanced or more inclusive international system, the type of rhetoric that you saw Moscow and Beijing release right before the invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, there is also the rhetoric of course, cooperation. Of cooperation and advancement for all peoples and equaling the voice of all peoples around the world. And yet the end goal, of course, is the same. It is to rally, though that has become increasingly difficult for China, to rally what we might call allies around that vision, right, of undermining the benign hegemony of the United States and its partners. And at the same time, to cast the United States and its partners as the threats to world peace, right? So that this goes to subordination of international institutions, be it the World Health Organization or the International Civil Aviation Organization or other UN-mandated and non-UN mandated organizations that try to structure international relations as we've practiced it since 1945. The fundamental problem that we face, of course, is that China and the United States have incompatible security drives. There cannot be a true equilibrium globally when the two most powerful nations in the world, in this case, I think, fair to say the two hegemons, have incompatible security interests. And I mean, obviously speaking as an American, on the role of one of them, we see it as an increasingly predatory hegemonic role, both regionally and globally. And so it seems that we have rather unpalatable choices. Either a balance of power, which requires constant competition, or an equilibrium, which we think, which is undermined by constant Chinese advances. So let me finish up in the last few minutes I have to keep us on time with one suggestion for the strategy that we should be pursuing, and then I really just do want to mention a few of these sacred cows. So very briefly, and I'm happy to come back to this in questions, the strategy that I think we should be pursuing is a strategy that was initially adopted by the Trump administration and has been followed to some degree, largely though not exclusively, by the Biden administration, although neither explicitly articulated it, and that is a strategy of reciprocity. I think what the strategy of reciprocity does is it allows us, at least in the short run, to step back from the moral undergirding of either side of the debate that we've traditionally had. Those two sides being, one, we must engage with China, and engagement is a good, and we'll bring it into norming with the system that we have, or that we must completely oppose, completely decouple, find ourselves in an open and irrevocable competition with China. Now, I think that Beijing has largely chosen that latter position. But I think better for our interests is to adopt a policy of reciprocity, both structural and issue-oriented. Structural on issues like trade. So you saw the Trump administration levy tariffs in an attempt to bring about a more equitable trade situation. On questions such as access for United States researchers, for American students and the like in China, but also on specific issues, issues such as direct espionage, attempts to steal intellectual property, the ban on American flights into China after COVID, things like that. Reciprocity allows us to determine the level of our response to China, but in a way gives China the ability to determine the dynamic of the relationship, meaning if it acts in cooperative measures, then they will be received with cooperative measures. Let me just finish up, as I mentioned, by trying to slaughter a few of the sacred cows. I think it is important to recognize that we are, the struggle over China policy is not over. I do not think we have fully turned a corner towards recognizing the rivalry, or more benignly, the competition that we are in, that there is a strong presumption still towards engagement, unrestricted engagement, coexistence with China, and that often, I believe, feeds into Beijing's ability to set the narrative. I think there is another sacred cow that has gained resonance in recent months, maybe the past couple years, and that is our problem with China comes down to two words: Xi Jinping. And that if Xi Jinping goes away, then we can get back to business as usual. Things will go back to a more balanced approach with China. We know how to handle these guys. We know how to handle the party. We've been doing it for 40 years. It's just Xi Jinping is the one who's caused the problem. And I think that is a mistaken assessment of the situation. And then finally, the notion that Xi Jinping is indeed the new great helmsman, that he is infallible. After Mao died, the party had struggled with figuring out how do they assess his legacy, and they came up with the 70-30 formula, right? 70% correct, 30% incorrect. I think the same thing will ultimately have to be done with Xi Jinping, and that his errors have created a more adverse environment for both the party and for China than is generally recognized. Internally, and Professor Cai just talked about this, the turn against the government, against the party because of zero COVID and because of the lockdowns, but long-term ongoing frustration with the lack of economic reform and the slowdown on the macroeconomic side. But more pertinently, perhaps for our interests and purposes, is that Xi has, in some sense, activated global antibodies against China, so that there are more negative impressions of China, more negative sense of what China is doing, a broad, a host of tensions with allies of the United States, with partners of the United States, and with countries, quite frankly, that China had hoped to sway over to its side. And this is the weak link, I think, in China's attempt to become a global dominant power that we should be focusing on to precisely take advantage of those fears, those concerns, and try to craft a more cohesive international community that responds to the challenge of this balance of power strategy that China has pursued. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Particularly your last point. I think the wolf warrior diplomacy has not had the desired impacts. And I keep saying, if you want to know what they're doing, just listen. They will tell you. And the more we pay attention to what they're actually saying, the better off we are. So excellent point. Emily.
Thank you. And I want to reiterate the thanks to you for having us, also for everyone who's still here in this room after a full day of programming. Also, thank you for that framing, because with the historical context, I think I have free rein to be ahistorical, which is the mode that I prefer. And I want to focus on the present because that avoids history, and in particular on how China projects power in the present, and how China leverages economic and industrial positioning and tools to do so, because that approach to power projection and really to coercion is non-traditional and should force a rethinking from the US, but also global perspective of what the competitive balance is, and also how we are going to address it, how to compete with China, where there are weaknesses, where there are strengths, and what they mean for the global system. China pursues at the national level a strategy of military-civil fusion. It is exactly what it sounds like. It entails the fusion of military and civilian tools, actors, and positioning for the sake of an integrated national ambition. Military-civil fusion, when it is assessed or explored in the US context, tends to be looked at in terms of the potential that commercial positioning or tools might become useful for traditionally military objectives. For example, the idea that a dual-use relevant technology might be obtained by a Chinese company and then converted into military equipment. Or the idea that a port investment originally intended or framed as a commercial one might become home to a military base. All of those are absolutely valid, essential parts of military-civil fusion, and among the measures that China pursues to project power internationally. But there's another element of China's military-civil fusion strategy that's less obvious, I think less frequently discussed, and perhaps even more critical. And that's the idea of using civilian and commercial positioning for coercive ends, not in a traditionally military or security way. How does this manifest? Endless examples. I think it's useful to start with supply chains as one of them. China for decades has worked actively to secure positions of dominance for itself in international supply chains by identifying what are critical sectors, identifying where there is opportunity to dominate nodes within them, and then supporting its companies, in many cases with stolen technology, but not always, to underprice and outcompete international players. And then to become the dominant player in the international value chain. This gives China leverage over countries, over companies, and therefore over the international system. And that leverage can be used to coerce. And Beijing has shown its willingness to do this. Beijing has, for example, in the context of a territorial dispute with Japan, cut off exports of rare earths in order to force Tokyo's hand. China also uses its supply chain dominance vis-a-vis companies to not only encourage or coerce them to act in China's interest, but also to coerce them to put pressure on their host governments to act in China's interests. And the entire thing stays within the framework of commercial positioning, commercial tools, but still deploys this really astonishing leverage over the global system, and not in a way that there's really a direct answer to. because the only way to avoid this is to fight against dependence on China in international supply chains, which means rethinking all free market assumptions about value chains, about globalization, about what economic strength or weaknesses are. Another example of China's power projection through economic and industrial means, or just economic warfare, is the use of commercial infrastructure to project power, again, not just by converting to military uses, but, for example, by to control resources. The tangible, very easy example of this is when China builds out commercial infrastructures in countries with significant resource benefits, like in African countries that have significant critical mineral reserves. And China builds out really integrated value chains or networks of infrastructure so that it ends up controlling the production, the distribution, and ultimately the shipment and consumption of the critical minerals in those countries. This, again, gives tremendous leverage. It gives leverage not only in those countries, but also internationally. And it does so far more effectively and efficiently than, say, deploying troops to this end. Less obvious, less tangible example is China deploying information and communications infrastructure to control information as a resource, whether that's telecoms or IT platforms, in order to gather valuable information from the global environment. And also, and this leads to point number 3 of China's industrial and economic warfare, in order to shape how that information is disseminated. Beijing has also, in its competitive framing, recognized the immense value that comes from shaping information for everything from economic to political to social competition and power. And civilian and commercial platforms are the prime way to do this, or a prime way to do this. TikTok is the hot button, readily available, and I think particularly useful case for showcasing this, although it's worth stressing that it is only one, and maybe too obvious of one. But TikTok as a platform risks granting China, or Chinese companies, and therefore China, access to incredibly valuable information on how people operate, on preferences, on the human, but also allows China to shape a narrative, whether that's by disseminating propaganda or potentially disseminating socially damaging information that can undermine the social processes of competitor nations. TikTok can also do maybe less obviously malign, or dissemination of information on platforms like TikTok can also serve less obviously malign ends, like informing people's economic preferences, advertising a Chinese player for consumption as opposed to an international competitor, and therefore furthering China's economic agenda. And the final example is China leveraging, and this goes back to the supply chain point, but is broader, but China leveraging economic integration and reliance on its market for political influence. And at the risk of speaking in an area where I'm not an expert and the person to my left is, Taiwan is an incredibly useful case here. Taiwan's market and the leaders in Taiwan's market depend on China. And they depend on China for production, as well as for other forms of economic integration. And that risks granting China coercive leverage over the island, well short of engaging in military interaction, which again transforms the competitive balance in a way that's much less obvious than where there are missiles deployed or what the possibility of an amphibious invasion is. Which leads to what all of this means. That was a lot of different examples. What they amount to is China wages economic warfare. And the implications of that are that we should, when we assess China's strengths, the weaknesses of the international system, and the competitive balance more broadly, be looking well beyond traditional forms of competition and conflict, and into ones that have, in many cases, been seen as, if not areas of cooperation necessarily, but areas that are outside of nation-state competition. And this change should inform how we as the US, but also as the international system, go about playing offense and defense, how we go about competing more broadly. For example, what security cooperation should look like among the U.S. and its allies and partners. With Taiwan, are there means that the U.S. can use to help Taiwan diversify its economy away from reliance on China, beyond simply providing Taiwan with military equipment that might help in the case of a military attack? With NATO allies, can there be investment in international infrastructure that creates resilience to China's efforts to project power through commercial positioning, and that goes beyond cooperation in much more conventional military domains? But also, for the U.S., looking more internally, our framing for national security should include supply chain weaknesses even outside of the traditional defense industrial base. And our framing for playing offense, for actively competing against China, should include areas where our conventional strengths allow us to, in a reciprocal fashion, impose costs on Beijing in exchange for its efforts to impose costs on us. Whether that's by working to limit China's access to advanced technologies that its industrial strategy rests on acquiring, or that's by revoking trade privileges granted to China by the U.S. and the international system, and that China manipulates for its own coercive ends. And I'll call it there.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. Now I'd like to go to Russell.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bremberg, and to the Victims of Communism Foundation for the invitation to be here and for hosting this event, and for allowing me to be here on this panel with such an excellent group of experts in their own right in terms of the issues that you're covering. I think you got already an excellent foundation on the historical and theoretical underpinning of China's growing power, as well as a technical analysis in the means by which it is utilizing its power to control and shape and influence the international system. And I think my role here will be primarily more to focus narrowly on Taiwan as a case example, but not necessarily here to make the case why it's so vitally important to support Taiwan, but more to give you really a current sort of state of play in terms of what is happening to Taiwan in cross-strait relations with really just some up-to-date developments with regards to issues related to Taiwan. So I want to focus on basically three clusters of developments. One is the recent August military exercises conducted by the People's Liberation Army around Taiwan, ostensibly in response to Speaker Pelosi's visit there in early August. The second cluster of developments is the impact of Russian invasion of Ukraine on Taiwan, within Taiwan, and how that is impacting public views with regards to important critical national security issues related to its national defense, since that also is an important factor in the overall consideration about Taiwan's resiliency and its ability to provide for an effective defense of itself along with its allies. And finally, just like we had here in the U.S. a midterm election, similarly in Taiwan, it had its own local elections that was just held in late November. And so I just want to go over briefly what the developments were from that election and what the implications will be for the more consequential presidential election in 2024. So briefly on the military exercises, the PLA conducted an unprecedented military exercise around Taiwan from August 4th through August 8th. This was a combination of both naval, aerial exercises, as well as the firing of missiles and rockets around Taiwan. The PLA designated 6 closure areas almost immediately when Speaker Pelosi's airplane approached Taiwan's airspace. And in those 6 designated closure areas, it subsequently fired reportedly 11 ballistic missiles and rockets in 5 of these closure areas. It's worth noting that these closure areas, several of which actually, if you track the coordinates, actually overlapped with Taiwan's territorial sea, which is within the 12 nautical miles, which would be an infringement of Taiwan's sovereignty had there been actions that were taken in there. 4 of these ballistic missiles reported overflew the main island of Taiwan. And that was perhaps one of the most provocative action taken by the PLA. 2 of these closure areas actually overlapped with the exclusive economic zones of Japan as well as the Philippines. So actually there's 2 closure areas that overlap with the Japanese EEZ and 1 that overlapped with the Philippines. So the exercises themselves, I think, as a signal, were not necessarily directed only at Taiwan, or even for that matter, the United States, but also regional allies and partners of the United States that may be called upon in the event of a Taiwan contingency. As I noted earlier, this is of a scale unprecedented since the 1995-1996 Taiwan Strait crises, wherein actually over a period of 8 months, the PLA fired 10 missiles. So if you take that in terms of just the volume of action taken in terms of the missile exercises of 11 missiles over a period of 1 day, and 10 missiles over the Taiwan Strait over 8 months in 1995 to 1996, you can understand that this is a far more sophisticated and also intense set of exercises. And but that being said, I do think that it's important to note as a sort of an analytical judgment that while there are important military values to these missile exercises and tests, they were more for their propaganda value, and it was far more important in that regard. This was even suggested in a lot of the analysis that were provided in by the Chinese defense analysts, speaking to official state media, referring to these actions as sort of choking the Taiwan secessionist activities and so forth. Overall, I think these exercises mark essentially a new normal, if you will, in terms of a semi-permanent state of higher levels of tensions. And I think we should expect that, these activities will continue to intensify in combination with, I would say, an uptick of hybrid warfare activities against Taiwan into 2023 and beyond. And just as a sort of a concluding note on this particular area, I think that there's a tendency right now to be hyper-focused on a all-out invasion scenario of Taiwan, and I think it's absolutely critical that we do focus on obviously this contingency, but we should also be working closely with Taiwan to address, I think, what is the more persistent threats that are facing Taiwan in the forms of these various hybrid warfare activities that Emily had also referenced earlier on economic warfare, cyber warfare, political warfare, and we can get into that in great detail if you would like in the Q&A in terms of the various methods that they've been employing in United Front influence operations vis-a-vis Taiwan. That I would just add that in many respects, in these areas in which Taiwan has been the target of such PRC activities, Taiwan is like the canary in the coal mine here, and we are finding that a lot of these sort of MOs, the sort of tactics and techniques that they're utilizing in Taiwan are actually happening also in other countries as well. So I think it's worth sort of exploring these issues and what's happening to Taiwan for a better understanding. The second, and I'll go, I know that in the interest of time here that I'll cover briefly, Ukraine, it is important to set these sort of developments against the backdrop of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is a global geopolitical event, a tragic event in terms of what is of Russia's illegal invasion and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. And I think this has also had an impact in Taiwan as well. And I think in a way that I think is quite profound in how it is shaping public opinion within Taiwan with regards to its own defense, in particular on issues of will to fight, which has long been a vexing issue with regards to the assessments about the resiliency of the Taiwanese public in being able to and willing to defend itself themselves. And I think it's just worth pointing out here in multiple polls that have been conducted in both in the aftermath of the Russian invasion, and as well as those that are comparing pre-invasion and post-invasion. We're saying that there are on average around 60 to 70% polled indicating a willingness to fight in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And then one particular poll, just as a point of comparison, it actually represented a near 30% increase from pre-invasion to post-invasion. So I think, the impact of which the Ukraine war has had in, I think, people's willingness to defend themselves is really profound. In other areas that has actually perhaps even more tangible impact in terms of national security and national defense issues within Taiwan is on matters related to mandatory military service, the duration of conscription, as well as issues related to reserve training as well. And these are very two concrete areas wherein it has a direct impact in Taiwan's, sort of military readiness and other matters. And herein also as well, the public has actually, in polls that are done, multiple polls done in Taiwan that have indicated an increase of nearly up to 70% of people who support the extension of the current conscription duration of 4 months, which I think all military analysts agree is woefully inadequate and too low, to extending it to almost a year. Now that has to work itself through, the political process and so forth. But, I think these polls are public. It is being debated. It's being and it's being assessed and considered very carefully, within Taiwan's political establishment. That I think that this is an important dimension of that, of the overall consideration. And lastly, I think I'll just. Lastly, I'll just go in on the implications of the local elections. So it's basically Taiwan held its 901 elections, which essentially covers 22 cities, counties, and special municipalities. It's called 901 because it basically the people are choosing 9 tiers of elected office within these localities, and they're all combined in one. So the opposition KMT party right now has earned 13 of these sort of mayors, magistrates, and the heads of these magistrates. And the ruling DPP had 5 seats. The remainder went to non-affiliated parties. Now, these local elections tend to focus on local issues, and I think that's a very important point to keep in mind in terms of as we assess the implications. However, though, it does give the opposition KMT momentum going into the primary process, which is going to happen in the first quarter of 2023. Wherein, the current president of Taiwan is barred from term limits from running again, and so there will be a new candidate from the DPP. And the current chairman, Eric Zhu, of the KMT, while has not indicated specifically whether he is going to in fact run, the strong, relatively strong showing in the local elections does seem to indicate that he will, he could become the KMT's candidate. Now, there are a lot of unknown variables here in terms of what may happen going forward, and so it's far from really a done deal in terms of who will be the presidency, but only to say that, looking forward right now, I think 2023 is shaping up to be a very interesting year, and I think the PRC will step up its pressure campaign, against Taiwan in order to shape the outcomes of that election. And I think I'll just conclude there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Russell. And we'll go over to Craig.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So much of the conversation in Washington today around U.S.-China relations is focused on preventing a hot war, right? And far fewer resources, I would say even far less attention is really focused on the current war of words that Beijing's already waging against us, specifically when we're talking about Chinese discourse power and its corrosive components, that malign influence that we're starting to really uncover here in the United States, but also in other countries. Discourse power has taken on a really renewed significance, I think, under Xi Jinping. Its roots trace back to the founding of the CCP, but we have seen this evolution in about the last 9 years where it has taken on growth in terms of leaps and bounds. And so, discourse power seeks to set and shape global narratives about China's composite national strength and its international influence. And the goal is building out, I think, what we've all spoken about here a little bit, is that alternate global architecture that really does reflect Beijing's values and interests. And so what we're seeing now, and I think Taiwan is a great test case of this, is the integrated employment across both peace and wartime of that public opinion, psychological and legal warfare to achieve China's ultimate objective. And at a basic level, here, I think in DC at least, seeking to alter global perceptions about Chinese autocracy and Western democracy, to compare and contrast and consistently misrepresent the two in ways that are advantageous to Beijing. And that is really significant because right now the conversation in Washington is very focused on this democracy autocracy framing and the weaponization of that conversation, as Michael mentioned, by Beijing. These sort of recent discourse distortions, though, and a series that I just want to touch upon here, have, I think, tremendous impact on our daily lives. And I think of us mostly in this room as fighting the front lines of Chinese discourse power, objectives and goals. And it's incumbent upon us to already think about how we're going to harden our defenses and sort of counter some of these things. And I think the first one that really has started to really, I think, reinforce itself to me is the focus or the idea that China is a democracy. You're seeing this. We all laugh, right? Someone just sort of gave me a little smile from the audience. They call themselves, right, a whole process people's democracy. We started to see back in 2021 through a paper that the State Council put out that talked about how China is the democracy that works. And we saw that same language reflected in Xi Jinping's work documents during the recent party congress. This has been institutionalized now across CCP rhetoric and discourse. In seeking to redefine democracy, though, right, they're doing it to suit their purposes and to legitimize their actions as representing the will of the Chinese people. And I think that to date, we haven't really heard an effective antidote from Washington or other countries to that. You are forced to engage in the conversation of whether, well, why isn't China a democracy? And they put out vast white papers where they make what they consider strong argumentation in that direction. But it is a discourse distortion, and it is one that is intended to open the door to a conversation about, do we own the definition of democracy? And what are the implications as we think about this democracy autocracy framing going forward for China's global ambitions and global influence? This is particularly true in the global South. And one small vignette is thinking through China's response and messaging around COVID and zero COVID in particular. Within weeks of zero COVID, the Chinese engaged in a massive messaging campaign across the global South, weaponizing both state-owned platforms, but also traditional media to talk about how China's model was superior to the West. They weren't seeing massive deaths like we were here in the United States and parts of Western Europe. And through a variety of different polling techniques and tactics in the last few months, we've seen that those tactics paid off. Views of Chinese governance improved remarkably throughout the global south in response to that coordinated messaging campaign, so much so now that many of those countries have favorable views on Chinese global narratives and global governance. That's a direct threat, once again, in that discourse domain to us and our message to these countries as we think through China's discourse objectives and ambitions. The second theme I just want to touch on briefly is something that I think Emily mentioned, is this idea of emerging public opinion spaces and dominating those. I don't think back in 2013 when the Chinese Communist Party was talking about discourse power that they envisioned TikTok, but here we are. It's the #1 news source for people 17 to 35 in the United States. Right? We're starting to see the use of those algorithms, and we saw them most recently during the recent protest movements, using the algorithms for control of information and data flows and data governance to suppress stories about what we were seeing in China, mainland China, and the external response to it, and controlling what the average viewer here and sort of listener, as they're sort of scrolling on their phone, is ingesting. And that's just one example. There's such a broad ecosystem that we really haven't touched upon yet, where they are controlling through data governance, and they're thinking about those algorithmic challenges and opportunities that Emily mentioned that are just so critically important. Apple is another great example. Recently, if you saw, Apple, in response to a request from the Chinese Communist Party, disabled the ability to airdrop messages. Once again, controlling data flows, controlling information, and suppressing information that is detrimental to the CCP fits very squarely within the construct of discourse power and controlling those emerging public opinion spaces. Standard setting, which Ambassador Brandtberg knows much about. The International Telecommunications Union being the most important, probably, international organization that no one has ever heard about. We are seeing this concerted effort, I think, to control digital infrastructure and data flows. And so much of that is designed to reinforce and to harness CCP messaging, all of which falls within what we would consider discourse power. And I would argue on that front, the West is losing, and losing quite badly. The last thing I wanted to touch upon was some of the evolution in Chinese election interference and lobbying here in the United States. A number of studies that were conducted over the last few months as we were leading up to our midterm election started to show a marked improvement both in the quantity and quality of Chinese election interference on particularly U.S. social media platforms. The idea being to sow doubt about the American electoral process, electoral integrity, and to champion autocracy as a better governance model. And as Xi Jinping has said, right, a quote, new choice for humanity. Some of the social media themes that were uncovered as part of these investigations were pretty shocking. The idea that you should question the efficacy of voting at all. That, quote, civil war is necessary to root out America's ineffective and incapacitated political system. Political violence against law enforcement. This was a central theme that was amplified in over 200,000 tweets from, as part of just one campaign that reached hundreds of thousands of Americans. And we wonder why we're having some of the, I think, like the social issues that we're sort of encountering here. And then other exploitation of cleavage points here in the United States on hot button sensitive social issues, abortion or gun rights. All of those were part of this broad-based Chinese electoral interference operation campaign that was run during this midterm election, which was very different than what we saw just 2 years ago, and far radically different, I'd say, than what we saw 4 years ago. We're just starting to uncover this, but it was across social media platforms, and it was in different languages, and it had far greater reach than anything that the Russians did back in 2016. Lastly, quickly on lobbying here in the Beltway and what we're seeing in the manipulation of language and discourse around Chinese companies and the threat posed by China and this concerted preference, I think, for engagement, the compete but coexist argument as opposed to compete to win argument, which I think is what's sorely missing from our discussion on U.S.-China relations. There's been this massive increase in Chinese lobbying, particularly in the high-tech sector, in response to increased scrutiny from the Biden administration, but also Congress. we're starting to really delve into some of those lobbying and political disclosures and seeing who the Chinese are hiring. And it's sort of fascinating as we see some of these vignettes. Here in Washington, D.C., Republicans are typically thought of as being harder on China than Democrats. But Chinese tech companies are hiring far more Republican lobbyists than they are Democrat lobbyists. Far more Republican former members of Congress and their members of their staff than Democrats. And this was happening well before the recent election and the changeover in the House. What we're starting to see too is that language, that framing, have actual impact. If folks have been following closely the National Defense Authorization Act that's currently being debated in Washington, there was a massive issue of discussing Chinese drones, the American Security Drone Act. The goal was to purge US systems of these drones. For a long time, it really looked like it was going to happen, but now we've learned through press reporting, right, that particular provision has been removed in response to a massive lobbying campaign by, you guessed it, DJI, the #1 Chinese drone manufacturer in the United States that hired some of the biggest and best names on K Street to advance its interests and its communication messaging on the Hill, but also publicly through massive digital buys. This is just one example of where the Chinese are able to exploit cleavages in our regulatory and legal loopholes to achieve actual outcomes in the real and now, not sometime in the future. I'll just close with saying that it sort of feels like we're missing some of the antidotes in our discourse to counter some of these big themes. And taken together, the Chinese are spending over $10 billion on discourse power that we know about. That starts a harder conversation, I think, here in the United States, and one that's politically fraught, but also societally fraught, about thinking about hardening our defenses, hardening our discourse, and really ensuring that we are reducing our exposure to these Chinese malign influence, not just here, but also arming other countries and other parts of the world to sort of identify, analyze, and interpret what they're seeing with Chinese discourse so they know what they are seeing and ingesting. This is an area where, just at least from my perspective, almost no work has been done. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Craig. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome questions from the audience. I know there are cards and pens. If you want to write a question, just raise your hand with it, and those will be collected. And while that's going on, I'll use my kind of moderator's point of privilege to offer a brief analysis, summary of what some things that were said and ask my question. And Craig, thanks for mentioning the ITU. Of course, it's now nice to see there is a newly elected American SG at the ITU, and hopefully that'll be a cause for some hope and optimism coming up in the future. But you touched on, or focused on basically the systemic competition, the competition between our systems of government, which I think, as you said, both sides are actually looking to frame that way at times. And of course, Michael, you talked about the need for reciprocity. I've looked at this through the context mostly through the straight diplomatic side in the multilateral space, but I think it's a factor in both the kind of military exercises or issues around economic coercion, which is that when they act, when the CCP acts, we do not effectively respond. There are not consequences for actions. When I use the word consequences, I do not mean, and are trying to suggest they be military, but just consequences of the diplomatic, political, economic nature. And that I think we, and I found this directly in my working meeting with their own ambassador, that we have a huge communications challenge, because I feel as though in many respects, in bilateral and multilateral settings, we've actually communicated with them pretty much the same way for several decades now. The issue has been the change in U.S. policy is not so much about what we're communicating. It's the idea that we actually now mean it, right? And that we actually want those words to have consequence. And for them, when I put myself in their shoes, they see this as a big change, that our past behavior has shown that when they act in ways in which we disapprove of, that we speak about it, and in fact may need to get them to acknowledge or speak in a way, a press release, a joint appearance, a statement. But we all recognize that underneath that, their actions aren't going to change. And that's what's changed is I think the American policy, our policy with the recognition of, wait a minute, this isn't working, we need to see changes. So I look at one issue, I mean, we've got hosts of issues that came up, particularly in the multilateral space. I see the imposition of the national security law in 2020 over Hong Kong as a kind of huge demarcation line. That this again was a place where they rightly anticipated, letters, statements of protest, perhaps condemnation, but really zero consequences. And that this is kind of fundamental to the relationship. And I want to throw out to the panelists, what's your perspective on, obviously you talked about reciprocity, but just how we go about approaching so that there are appropriate, in my mind, consequences or responses to actions so that, because my fear is ultimately they will continue to learn the wrong lesson, in which there aren't consequences, and which can lead to even more dangerous behavior. So let me throw that out there, whoever wants to jump in. And again, we welcome your questions. If you have them, raise your hand with the paper.
Well, I just say they've learned the right lesson, right? I mean, there are no consequences, but I think we have to understand the historical background to that, and I think it ties in with what Craig was talking about, right? Because on the face of it, you would think, well, how in the world would these messages from a regime that has imprisoned millions of Uyghurs, we've talked about that today, that has crushed Hong Kong's freedoms, that forces abortions, that has prison camps. How could these messages be accepted at face value? Accepted at face value because we are at the end point, so to speak, of a half-century era in which we have been conditioned. We have been conditioned to accept the idea that China is peaceful, that its rise was peaceful, that it was going to become a responsible stakeholder, that the relationship was so important, and I think, Andrew, this gets a little bit to your point, that the relationship was so important that we could not risk upsetting it over minor issues, such as theft of intellectual property or interference, or the fact that China has shipped untold amounts of fentanyl into this country. So the point is that what we're talking about now, there's we can sort of, flagellate ourselves and wear hair shirts. We have to recognize that it's the end point of a very long period in which China very successfully used propaganda and influence campaigns. And if you want to read more about that, I would highly recommend Alex Joski's new book, Spies and Lies, which is one of a number of books that cover this, but I think is really excellent on the specific ways in which the party set up front organizations, think tanks, promoted exchange, seeded, and by the way, all run by the intelligence services, right? There's not espionage operations by the intelligence services, but influence operations, seeding MSS officers as journalists and international organizations and the like. That's why what Craig talked about, I think, has such purchase, not because it suddenly appeared yesterday, but because we've been conditioned for 50 years to accept those messages. And I agree with him, and if he's right, and he is, that we have to fight back against it, we have to understand just how far behind we are in that struggle. It doesn't start as an equal playing field. They're not at first base, they're at third base.
Yeah, obviously I agree. I think even just the specious framing that China is rising results in it drives escalation risk concerns here in the United States. And I think that there's been some great research done recently that show that maybe we should question that China rising narrative and what does it really mean for us? I think what Gray Zone teaches us, and I think Taiwan is probably the test case I'm interested to hear what Russell thinks is, aggression begets aggression, because even as China ramps up its activities in this messaging space and the sub-crisis maneuvering, it actually hasn't achieved its ultimate objectives yet. So therefore it must continue to engage in them to achieve that de facto political and military supremacy in that space. And I think the challenge for us so much so here is that, and I don't think that comparisons to the Cold War, I think they happen to be imperfect, and I'm not sure we should hold ourselves prisoner to them, but there's a significant loss of muscle memory, as I think Michael touched upon, of how we do wage this battle. And I think that there are just some really important lessons, particularly from the early Reagan years, and how they approached this systemic challenge. And they accepted early on that we cannot coexist with this maniacal genocidal sort of entity. And that shouldn't be the idea. We should not, competition is a means, not an end. And if you don't articulate that end state, which frankly, I would say this administration and the prior administration didn't exactly do, we don't really know where we're going. And so I think that thinking a little bit about some of the steps that were taken in the early 80s to really weaponize the Soviet Union's weaknesses and the dependencies that I think are just so flaring and apparent in a lot of Emily's work as well in supply chains gives us tremendous leverage. And for too long, we assumed China was rising. And I think we have a lot more agency here that we perhaps give ourselves credit for.
Excellent. Let me, we have a lot of questions. I apologize. We will not get to all of them, but thank you for them. So let me, and I know, I think, Russell, you're about to speak. I have a question directed to you, and you can combine in it. What do you think would be the most proactive actions the U.S. and liberal democracies can take to help Taiwan from China's political warfare?
Great. Excellent question. And here, you know what, I'm going to tackle, one of the beasts of sort of Taiwan policy head on here, which is the so-called symbolism versus substance debate, right? And oftentimes the sort of symbolism is derided as something that has absent of real value. And herein, actually, in the context of cross-strait relations, symbolism has a great deal of substance. And that sort of support, international support, direct bilateral support, has a huge impact in terms of strengthening morale and resiliency within Taiwan, where issues with regards to how China is engaged in persistent political warfare against Taiwan, both through covert and overt means, demonstrable, open, public signals of support for Taiwan are important. And I think the more that's done internationally with like-minded partners will only help to strengthen the resiliency of the public in being able to respond when, when the public is faced and the government's faced with, a huge volume of PRC propaganda and military coercion on a near daily basis now, in terms of the intrusions that are occurring now with the most, all but erased median line across the Taiwan Strait, which had essentially acted as a sort of a buffer between, Taiwan and mainland China. And so I think in that way, sometimes we need to think. We oftentimes focus so exclusively on the military threat that we forget that actually a large dimension of this contest across the Taiwan Strait is happening politically, and that we have to be able to address and respond to these political dynamics in a way that I think that can help address, I think, what will be the more persistent, imminent challenges that Taiwan will face going forward. And then, just if I may, on the, I just want to pick up quickly on what Craig had said earlier, which is, and respond to the comment that was made with regards to how aggression by the PRC essentially was not met with any consequences. And as a result of that, I think what China is finding that it is doing is that it will, act more aggressively, right? And and I think that is precisely, for a very long period of time, what's been happening in the Taiwan Strait. And I think only fairly more recently, with the sort of more proactive responses taken by the United States, as well as like-minded allies and partners, in responding to these actions taken by the PRC and the PLA, have you seen Beijing now respond, to what those consequences are, which is, what they are concerned about, which is, again, I think much more in terms of, the more of the sort of the political signals that U.S. support and like-minded support implies towards Taiwan, and that goes for not only its sort of political leadership but also the people of China as well.
So recognizing that we are almost out of time, I'd like to invite each panelist to provide a kind of closing summation, your thoughts, and for a couple, I'll tease out a quick question that maybe you can kind of try to include in your closing comments. So we'll start with Michael, and you can wrap up any way you wish, but one question that was directed to you and specifically was about how do you evaluate the reciprocity strategy in terms of China's relations with the U.S. alliance, such as Germany, France, and other allied countries in terms of the interplay between our approach to reciprocity vis-a-vis our alliance structure. So, but you can try to tackle that if you wish, or.
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure. I just have a few minutes because everyone else has to speak. I'd just say, we always say one of our great strengths is alliances, but we also have to recognize there's difficulties with alliance as well because of their own interests, and China's been very successful, particularly in working in Europe and the elite capture in Europe. When you look at the ways that it's influenced the Greek government, for example, Czech government, and other governments, and in terms of tamping down human rights pronouncements and the like. Of course, trade issues, buying or leasing of ports. So it is very difficult. I would just let me wind up simply by saying, one thing I think is important, I'm not sure 100% germane to the discussion we've been having, but I do want to say is that for those of us who do believe that this is a rivalry, that China's an adversary, that this is a major problem, if not a direct threat to us, I do think we have to take seriously the other side of the debate. We can't just ignore it. And that other side of the debate has a lot of facets. I would just highlight maybe the main facet, which is to say, aren't we overreacting, right? China has not invaded Taiwan. It's not invaded the Senkakus, so on and so forth. You can go down the line, and that's an important. I think that's an important distinction between the sides that we have to acknowledge it. We have to be careful that we don't sound shrill. I think we have to be willing to recognize or at least entertain the ideas where the post-1972 engagement policy brought gains to the United States, or at least have a very serious discussion about that. Because if we simply go down the one line that this is an existential threat to the United States, then I think it makes it harder both to make the points in ways that gain adherence and come up with clear policy. That's why I favor reciprocity. I think it allows us to step back from some of the broader, more dramatic issues and instead focus very narrowly on what hurts us, what helps us, and in that way try to recenter our interests at the core of the relationship.
Thank you. Emily?
I'll be very brief, but I want to go back to the point of responding to China's competitive mode. And I think Craig hinted at this or said it explicitly, but one of the big problems is that we put de-escalation as an end goal. And competition is the end goal. Protecting and bolstering the international system is the end goal. But so often I think the U.S. tendency is to define success according to conflict not happening. And that doesn't work in an environment where conflict is happening. And we're just turning a blind eye to it. There's one other beat that's probably less important, but I also think that there's a tendency to respond to China in kind. China pursues discourse power in these ways. That's a threat. So we need to develop discourse power in similar ways. We're a different system. We have different strengths. We have different weaknesses. We're going to lose that fight. And I don't think Still don't think there's been the effort taken to say this is our end goal as a country, and then these are the weaknesses and strengths we need to defend and we can leverage in reaching that, and then here's how China's trying to subvert it and what the response is, going back to an origin state and then working towards a future state, not simply trying to work tit for tat in, kind of a faux version of competition.
Thank you. Russell.
Great. I think the only point that I would add as a closing note is that, and this relates to Emily's point about the escalation as an end goal, and that is I would be wary about the arguments that I hear, which I don't think represents the mainstream of the sort of the Taiwan policy, China policy community, but wary of the argument that's being made that the United States needs to make credible assurances to Beijing with regards to its one China principle with the one China understanding. I would say that this is actually this is an old habit that I think we have been unable to kick, which is faced with Beijing's recalcitrance, the only method in which we understand and we can deal with it, so not necessarily try to change its behavior, but necessarily change ours or that of Taipei, for that matter. And that is, I think, also ignores to a large degree, what China is doing right now in terms of its military posturing is also for its political objectives as well. And if we understand that more carefully, we can recalibrate the responses in a way that I think would not necessitate, I think, this sort of what I would call an overreaction to some of the, these developments that we see in terms of how we can, manage tension in the Taiwan Strait. If I had not stated it earlier, again, I think we are entering a semi-permanent state of heightened tension. I think one of the important parts of addressing the issues going forward is being able to kind of just accept that level of higher friction and being able to then manage it accordingly.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think the thing that's missing for me, and where I'm most interested, is there's an economic and prosperity discussion that's missing here in the United States in terms of countering China's global ambitions and trade as a tool of foreign policy. Trade has become a four-letter word here from both political parties, and I think it's sort of to our detriment as we think through reducing regional economic reliance on China and really challenging China in its own backyard, but thinking through some of these broader questions that I think obviously folks like Nate, Emily, and others are looking at supply chain connectivity and friendshoring, and these are great. We sort of have to operationalize them and start to do that sooner. We have to move from like the theoretical to like the practical. And I think that if COVID, if anything is going to come out of COVID, the black swan moment, the zero COVID opportunity for business to reduce their reliance on China and sort of reduce the structural and economic interlink and that dependence that exists. It's right now. Like this is an actual moment to do it, whether it's because of something that the US is sort of putting forward, but more importantly, because of something that the Chinese did to themselves, a self-inflicted wound. And I just think that that's sort of an area that we haven't fully explored. It has implications for Taiwan's security and strengthening ties with Taiwan and free trade. Particularly, it's the one thing everyone in Southeast Asia that I've talked to in the last 6 years says, please give us market access, please talk to us about free trade. And it's the one thing that both Democrats and Republicans seem unwilling to budge on. And I think there's probably a broader conversation about what a prosperity agenda needs to look like to take on China's global ambitions.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our panelists. This will conclude the final panel, and I will just deliver some very brief closing remarks. Thank you, everyone. So yes, this ends our formal program for the day. I want to thank everyone for coming, and I just want to close on a note. I didn't want to take the time during the panel discussion, but and in fact, someone asked a question that was exactly what I wanted to close on. The question that I didn't answer in the previous panel was, to what extent has the West's recognition of mass atrocities against Uyghurs and other groups impacted China's foreign policy and ability to leverage the international system? And the answer is, we don't know yet. That's what's happening right now. Why I'm so thrilled that we could host the film screening last night, the important conversation we had earlier today on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and everything that is happening right now in the United States. And in particular, as we saw earlier, just a couple months ago in October, there was the first attempt ever in the UN Human Rights Council to hold a vote on the question to have a debate on China's human rights abuses taking place in Xinjiang. For those of us, I'm sure everyone in this room, following that, we saw that vote narrowly failed. But the answer to the question is not final, because nothing is ever final unless you give up. So it's my hope and expectation that we will see the United States once again at the next session of the UN Human Rights Council in March bring this question back before the international community and demand accountability and a response where that decision is voted on again and in fact passes. So for all of you that have joined us today, both here in person and those online, thank you for your incredible work, your support and dedication. This was a really impactful and really interesting China Forum we had this year. And I want to wish everyone the very best. Thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you.